Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 275 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. And on the show today, we'll be looking at electric aviation. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers, helping you find and pay for public charging with confidence. Our main topic of discussion today is electric aviation. I was at the Farnborough Air Show last year, and one reason I wanted to go there, other than the fact that I love watching planes, was that there were several companies there who were providing offerings that are seeking to reduce the carbon footprint of aviation and flying in general. Now, I've said before on this show that globally we buy 4 billion air tickets per year. Now, 2 million of those are for trips that are fewer than 500 miles. So obviously, there's a huge potential to decarbonise there. The industry have identified that they have a responsibility to reduce their carbon footprint. Now, for reference, the global aviation industry has a carbon footprint equal to or greater than a large number of countries worldwide, including the United Kingdom. The main issue is that emissions in the industry are not reducing despite commitments from the airlines to do so. The other main issue is that the reason emissions are rising is because air travel is rising. Rising air travel is resulting in airlines putting on more routes, which is resulting in more planes being bought. I mean, there were deals for $80 billion worth of new aircraft struck at the Farnborough Air Show recently, and this is putting a strain on airports, so more runways are being built. But it's all a little bit self-fulfilling. A rise in air traffic will put pressure on airports, but if more runways are built, then airlines will have more slots to fill. If they have more slots to fill, they'll advertise more, they'll get more customers flying, often at ridiculously cheap rates, and the cycle continues. Now, I've talked about this on the show before. I checked a while back, and if you want to fly from London Airport, any London airport, to any New York airport, you have a choice of 30 flights per day. Now, these range from the smallish Airbus A320 through a Boeing 737 MAX, a Boeing 777, an Airbus A330, an Airbus A350, right up to a 787 Dreamliner. Now, at one point not too long ago, you could take an Airbus A318, all business class, with just 32 people, from London City Airport to JFK. Now, we no longer fly the huge 747 across the Atlantic as a rule, nor the Airbus A380. Now, if we flew fewer flights with bigger planes, would that be better? Should we really be doing transatlantic flights in planes that only carry 200 people? Well, anyway, that's a discussion for a whole different podcast. And in fact, I've written about this on the EV Musings Substack if you want to check it out, and the link is in the show notes. Now, today I want to talk about where we are with decarbonising aviation in general. And unfortunately, it's not a pretty situation. If you speak to the airlines, they'll pretty much tell you the same thing. We're doing our best to decarbonise. We're implementing better routing software. We're buying planes that are more efficient. We're changing our processes to ensure that they do things like taxi on one engine to the end of the runway before starting the second engine for the actual flight. They also mention SAF, Sustainable Aviation Fuel. This is, ironically, the aviation equivalent of HVO, the diesel substitute. It's an almost drop-in fuel, which is much less carbon intensive to make, can be burned in exactly the same way as aviation kerosene, and it will result in a huge drop in CO2 emissions from aviation. Now, the problem with all these solutions, the processes and the single engines and the SAF, is that they're mostly greenwashing. Here's why. Taxiing on one engine to the end of the runway will count for a minuscule reduction of CO2, especially as the takeoff is the most carbon-intensive part of the flight. Routings that save a few hundred miles are all well and good, but if you're increasing the number of flights taking that shorter route, it's still a net increase in emissions. And SAF is, like hydrogen, a solution which appears to solve the problem, but in fact it does nothing of the sort. So let's talk about SAF. Let's talk about sustainable aviation fuel. Now, SAF is made from things like wood chippings and plants, etc. And the logic goes that these plants have already absorbed a certain amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they've grown, and burning them will only release that CO2 into the atmosphere. Thereby, the use of SAF is carbon neutral. At a theoretical level, that is, of course, accurate. In practice, however, the production, processing, transport, they all emit greenhouse gases, thereby reducing the overall carbon reductions. Now, tests indicate that biofuels developed from non-food crops and forest residues save 91 to 95% of the CO2, and that is commendable. But it runs into the same issue that hydrogen pilot projects tend to run into, and that is the question of scale. If you're running a hydrogen pilot project to show that you can source, transport, and use hydrogen for some sort of transportation role, it's usually quite easy to do that for a limited amount of hydrogen sourced from limited locations and delivered to limited users. But when that pilot project is then scaled up to a much larger user base, the issues then start to arise. And this is what happens with sustainable aviation fuel. As of 2022, some 450,000 flights had used sustainable aviation fuels as part of the fuel mix. Now, this sounds impressive until you remember that that's just a small proportion of the total number of flights carried out globally every year. And the key word in there is part of the final mix. There are very few flights that have run totally on sustainable aviation fuel. So SAF is not a solution. At best, it's a salve on the wound. It will help, but it won't cure. So what are the potential solutions we have for decarbonising air travel? Well, the only guaranteed way to reduce the carbon footprint of air travel is to reduce the number of flights. Now, obviously, this isn't a popular option for a lot of airlines. They want to make as much money as possible. So to do that, they want to fly as many flights as possible, which means we need to look at ways to make the flights we do be as carbon poor as possible. And one way of doing this is by electrifying them. At Farnborough last year, there were several companies that were working in the electric aviation space. And the problem is that many of them were eVTOL planes, i.e. planes that were in effect airborne taxis, short range, small number of passengers, take off and land vertically like a helicopter. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing bad about that. But if you want to make a serious dent in airline emissions, we need to be looking at other solutions. Solutions such as the Aviation Alice. Now, this is a commuter plane, fully electric, designed to carry 9 passengers in comfort over a daylight visual flight rule range of 250 nautical miles, or about 228 statute miles. Now, that might not sound a lot, but it's enough to replace the shuttle service between London and Manchester, London and Paris, London and Amsterdam, and London and Dublin. A range like that would get you from Paris to London, to Brussels, to Antwerp, to Amsterdam, to Stuttgart, Cologne, Dusseldorf, Geneva, Lyon, and the Channel Islands. Over in the US, this would get you from Chicago O'Hare Airport to Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Lansing, Michigan, Detroit, Cedar Rapids in Iowa, Rochester in Minnesota, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Cincinnati and Louisville in Ohio. That's 7 states. Unfortunately, and we'll come back to this later, aviation seemed to have run out of money and development has stopped. But that doesn't mean that electric aviation is dead in the water. And to talk more about this, I want to introduce Guy Haydon.
My name's Guy Haydon, and I work for Aerovolt as Chief Commercial Officer.
Right, we're discussing electric aviation today. So tell me your aviation story. How came you love flying?
Yeah, my aviation story goes back a little bit, actually. So my first job out of college, long before my EV journey, was I always wanted to fly and join the Navy to do so. So I did the selection for Royal Navy pilot selection and then got in, and 3-4 months later, after doing sort of all the fun militarization phase, boots and bergens, running up hills until people are sick and the fun stuff, I was medically discharged because I have a peanut allergy. So that was the end of my glittering Top Gun career. So that's kind of where the aviation thing started. And then obviously, as you know, I've been in EV for a long time. So for it to come back now is feels a bit full circle, but happily fell into EV and have been in electric vehicle charging for a long time. But when the opportunity to join Aerovolt in the very, very early days came up, yeah, it felt like one of those sort of serendipitous moments.
Yeah, as someone who went through the PPL private life training, 2007, it was one of those really, really exciting things. And unfortunately, I'm at the situation now where when I've got the money to be able to afford to do it, I don't have the time. And when I've got the time to be able to afford to do it, I don't have the money. So
this is the perennial problem there, right?
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
I want to come on and talk about Aerovolt and the offering that you've got shortly. But before we go into that, can we just discuss some of the things in the current aviation space and look at what I would call barriers to sustainability? Because we know that aviation, in the big scheme of things, it doesn't have a huge carbon footprint, but in terms of the way it's going and the small proportion of people globally who contribute to that, sustainability in aviation is a bit of a challenge. So let me throw a few things out there and give me your thoughts on what we can do to sort of reduce the footprint or increase the sustainability for frequent flyers, for example.
Yeah. Okay, I'll do my best. Frequent flyers is something that it does get asked. I mean, it's not our world of things at the moment with electric aviation and where it's at. But yeah, frequent flying, I think it's a fact of the economy and the globalized world that we live in. And depending on your definition of frequent flight, you do have those that fly a lot for leisure, and perhaps there's more questions around that. But I do think sometimes frequent flyers that, for business or for those that are actually, doing it either to support their families or for economic reasons, I think it is a fact of a globalized world. And that doesn't make it necessarily right, but I think perhaps the onus is on more of the system and the infrastructure and the airlines themselves to sort rather than the individual. And that's not to take it away from, there are individuals who make pledges not to fly and who fly a lot less and make their own personal conscious decisions. And I certainly respect that, absolutely. I think it's more a case of there are those that frequent fly, but it's very difficult for them to avoid doing so.
It's interesting because back in a former life, I used to do between 100 and 150 business flights a year.
That's quite a few, Gary.
Yeah, I was doing between 2 and 3 flights a week every week because I lived in London and worked in Berlin and Frankfurt. Now, back then, because of the nature of the work that I was doing, it was very difficult to avoid doing that traveling. In the late 80s, early 90s, where we didn't understand about the impact or the potential impact of flying at the time. The nature of the flying that I did after that became a little bit more, well, you need to fly out for a meeting in Madrid. And you're going out in the morning, you're coming back in the evening. And I think a lot of that nowadays could be offset with some of the technologies that have come up, particularly since COVID with Zoom and things like that. So I think there are definitely options available for certain members of the frequent flyer community.
Yeah. And I would equally agree that, if you look at Europe particularly, and unfortunately I have to remove the UK from that bracket, but if you look at mainland Europe, there's a lot to be said for very good public transport systems, and the train systems are, particularly excellent on sort of continental Europe. In the UK, we all know we suffer from an overloaded, overly expensive public transport system that is not good enough, frankly. So it's very difficult, I think, to do business in the UK or even outside of the UK without flying or without using private transport.
So the next one to talk about is private jets. If we look at private jets, the consensus seems to be for the people who have private jets, well, I need it because it saves me time. I'm not sure whether it saves me money, but it allows me a level of convenience and privacy that I can't get using commercial airlines. Now, if we look at somebody like, let's pick a name from the ether, Taylor Swift, one of, if not the most famous people on the planet, I can fully understand 100% why she would want to go everywhere in a private jet. And then you get down to some of the Formula One drivers, et cetera, and I can kind of go with that. But, there is a guy on YouTube who just happens to be quite a wealthy, I wouldn't even say industrialist. He owns a tool and die company or something like that. He's got his own private jet. He travels all around America to, sometimes to visit places that he's doing business with, sometimes just to go and watch, the Formula One Grand Prix in Austin. Now, at some point, if we accept, yes, Taylor Swift should probably have a private jet, where's the point at which you draw that line and say, well, hang on, your man there who's just using his plane because he can afford one, should he be included in that? Where's the demarcation line for people who should or shouldn't have private jets?
Yeah, and I think depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers from nobody should have a private jet all the way down to anybody who can afford it should be able to have a private jet. And essentially, the reality of the world we live in is anybody who can afford it can have a private jet. The question there comes down to how do we long-term decarbonize that as an industry and as a service to individuals and to businesses that use it. And it also comes down to, for now, we don't have a solution. So how best do we mitigate against that? Things like carbon offsets and putting money into projects that are reducing carbon and doing good. I think it's a difficult one because, if you look at certainly big corporate America. And if you look at corporations around the world, the private jet is a useful tool in terms of time and in terms of getting things done, but B is also seen as kind of a symbol of that corporate world. And I'm not saying that's right, but I think it's a difficult one to legislate against. And I think the answer is more around regulation, whether that be in terms of what is possible on private jet use or in terms of what mitigating steps have to be taken. But I think those measures will be an interim to a future where you have private jets that can be electric, hydrogen, hybrid, sustainable fuel, all those types of things are possible. And now we are starting to see it. I mean, if you look at electrification now and what's available from battery technology, it's entirely feasible that up to perhaps a medium 15, 20 seat private jet, in the medium term future, electrification is fully possible with the tech we have now. So I think there's answers, but yeah, what the answer is right now, I don't have a silver bullet, unfortunately.
Just to round off this sustainability aspect here, what's your view on the current aviation situation and sustainability? Now, I know you and I attended a conference earlier on this year at Farnborough about sustainable aviation, and there was a lot of talk about sustainable aviation fuel.
Yes.
And I kind of class this alongside hydrogen in road vehicles. It's really, really easy to put together a nice pilot project that can show that it works. But when you try and scale that up to the level that's needed, there could potentially be issues. What's your thought on sustainable aviation fuel for decarbonising aviation?
Yeah. I mean, I will come to that. But firstly, I suppose just to echo a wider point on the industry. If I'm being completely honest, there's a lot of talk and not a lot of doing. And that's the issue. And I think, a lot of industries have suffered from this at various points. But aviation at the minute, you go to a lot of conferences and a lot of seminars where the conversation is, we need to do more on sustainability and we need to do more on sustainability. And let's talk about SAF and let's talk about hydrogen and a little bit of let's talk about electric. But there are companies out there doing things. But in terms of mass global movement in the industry, it still feels like it's at a talking stage and people need to start putting their money where their mouth is. In terms of sustainable aviation fuel or SAF, yeah, you're right. It could be a great part of the answer. Depending on who you ask, sustainable aviation fuel can deliver anywhere between 98% carbon savings or all the way down to 20% carbon savings, depending on who you ask. And the issue we've got is being able to produce it at the scale it's needed. It's very easy to say, oh, we'll just do that. But what you have to remember is the whole aviation industry, and indeed, most industries, transport industries, they're built on decades and decades and decades of supply chain that's been built up. It's not one simple answer. So SAF absolutely can be part of the solution. And I'm not a SAF expert, but my question, if there were an expert in the room now, would be, how do we produce it at such scale? And I think that's a question that remains unanswered.
Absolutely. So moving on, talk to me a little bit about some of the electric aviation success stories that are currently out there. Let's start.
Yeah.
You probably know quite well the Pipistrel.
Yep. The Pipistrel. We own one. We fly one about. So the Pipistrel Velis, little 2-seat trainer, 450 kilos, small aircraft, right? Long wingspan, small aircraft. Very capable in terms of what it does. That was the first commercially available electric aircraft that you could go and buy, and still right now is. If you want to go and buy one today, that's the only game in town. And the Velis it's a 2-seat trainer essentially, so it flies for about an hour, has good capabilities, modern avionics, nice inside, easy to fly, and delivers a lot to the pilot. And flight schools that are using it certainly like it, and absolutely it's been successful in what it intended to do, which is prove electrification and stimulate the market. As some of the people listening might know, and some may not, I did 9 or so years in car charging. And so when that first Nissan Leaf came out, that was kind of when I entered the industry. That's where we are at now in aviation. And the Pipistrel, I always say, is a pretty good comparison to the Nissan Leaf. It was a demonstrator of what's possible. It wasn't overly weird or overly different. Yes, early adopters were the ones who went for it, but it really proved a direction of travel. And from there, things began to snowball. So the Pipistrel, very successful aircraft, and has spurred on what we're seeing now, which is all the others that are coming to market.
So talk to me about the others. One of them I sort of had a quick look at earlier on was the Alia from Beta Technologies. Are you aware of that one?
Yep, the Beta Alia. They're pretty much, I'll say one of, depending on who you ask, but I would say they're pretty much the leaders in terms of what's happening in the world of eVTOL or electric vertical takeoff at the moment. So the Beta Alia can take off vertically and fly kind of like a regular airplane, if you imagine, and then land vertically. Equally, it can land like a regular airplane. And what's very interesting there is not only have they built something and they flight tested it and it's working, but they've actually started to deliver to customers. So there's a couple of customers, one in Norway, one in New Zealand, who are actually hands-on with those aircraft right now. It's still in, let's say, what would be, from a regulatory standpoint, termed experimental phase, because it's not fully certified, but customers are already becoming familiar with those aircraft and their order books are full. So that's really good from a electric vertical takeoff perspective. But equally, in the fixed wing, which is, frankly, it's the easy bit, because we've already got lots and lots of small 2, 4, 6-seater aircraft flying around. And we've got, in the next year, another 2 or 3 electric aircraft coming to market. One we're very excited about is the Bristol B-23 Energic, which is another 2-seat trainer, but it will be the first aircraft that you'll be able to do a full PPL, private pilot's license, on. It has all of the capabilities to do that. So we have a close relationship with Bristol, who build the airframe, and also with H55, who build the powertrain. So they've come together to build this next gen trainer, and yeah, we're excited about that. In fact, we've got a couple coming our way.
Whatever happened to, because when I kept my eye on for quite a while, was the Aviation and their Alice offering, which had the potential to be really, really good, because that effectively looked like a private jet, had 9 seats and, what was it, 300, 400, 500-mile range, and then suddenly kind of disappeared. Have they gone bust?
I believe they went bust. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to do some Googling, but I believe essentially, to be completely plain, building aircraft is really, really expensive and takes a really long time. So they've built some excellent tech. And I think it could be, hopefully it's, with Lilium is a European example. Lilium built an electric vertical takeoff aircraft and were moving forward and had built some very good tech underneath it. Ultimately ran out of money before they got flying. And now there is a company interested in buying the proprietary tech and buying kind of the work that had been done there. So hopefully we'll see the Aviation Alice fly in some form at some point. But yeah, commercial realities, unfortunately, Gary.
Yeah, and it's been the same with electric vehicles generally. There's been quite a few that have been lauded as the next big hope, and they've just run out of money and gone into liquidation, disappeared off the face of the earth. It happens, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does. But again, in a lot of cases, that tech can then be utilized. It's in some ways, it's all bricks in the wall. It's all good things that are being built. And yeah, I also hope that we can see a future for the Alice, because that was a very exciting aircraft. And that's exactly, as you say, it's an example of the type of aircraft that can be used to replace business jets. And there's other examples. But yeah, watch this space.
Let's move on and discuss Aerovolt itself. What was the idea behind it? Why did you decide that this is something you wanted to focus on?
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about planes and stuff that flies. So lots of people are building planes and stuff that flies, which have batteries in them. I mean, eVTOL, we've name checked, but there's over 1,000 registered designs of electric vertical takeoff aircraft. And if you look across the OEMs in the fixed wing world, they're all either flight testing right now with electric powertrains, building electric powertrains into their aircraft, or have plans to do so. Even Robinson Helicopters announced last month that they want by next year to have their first R44 version of their helicopter flying electric. So there's a lot going on the side of the aircraft. We kind of took the view, why is nobody doing charging? And when our founder, Phil, saw the Pipistrel, tried the Pipistrel, liked the Pipistrel, said, how do you charge it? They wheeled out essentially like a little trolley charger. And that was the solution at that point. And Phil, the immediate reaction was, well, what happens if you want to fly anywhere, right? Can't take it with you. So somebody needs to build a network. And it was literally as simple as that. There is so much going on the OEM side. Why is no one building a network? So Aerovolt, that's what we set out to do. So we're building currently the world's first public network for electric aircraft.
How's that going?
Well, frankly, it's been a tale of 2 stories, really. There's a lot going on in the OEM world, as I say, and the airports are aware of it. So what that means is, with very, very limited funds so far, we've been able to realize 7 sites. They're live. People are flying in and out of them. We've got flight schools using them. You rock up, tap a card, charge your plane exactly the same as you would charge a car. So that's very positive. And we've built a software stack that sits behind it where you can do things like book your charging. You can even book aircraft through there. And we're integrating that with some of the biggest flight planning tools in the world, some of the biggest avionics providers in the world. So there's some really good software side plugins that we've done that make the Aerovolt network an easy switch, let's say, for a pilot who's never flown electric before. And they've got the pieces of the puzzle to make it straightforward for them. Business development and software development good, and our pipeline now of airports is more than 350 across UK, US, Europe and Australia. And we've got a number of other territories that want us to go and install in. And the issue we've got is not having the sites to go and install, having the interest to go and put our kit in the ground. It's been, like many other businesses, frankly, it's been fundraising. And that's what we've spent a lot of certainly the last 12 months doing, is fundraising. I can't say too much on that front, obviously, but I will say we're getting to the point now, and I think most people would agree that 2024 for fundraising was a nightmare. I could use a lot of words, but 2025, particularly sort of post Q1, things have really picked up. And so we're getting close to certainly realizing a number of things that'll bring some money in, and equally some additional fundraising. For us, like obviously I can't say much on fundraising. We're hoping soon to be at the end of that road and be able to put lots and lots of stuff in the ground. But yeah, things have been going very, very well for us. I mean, we have some leading names count amongst our partners. So yeah, just the magic ingredient now, Gary.
The dilemma that people in your industry have, i.e. providing charging, is you've always got the two-edged sword of, do we put chargers in order to induce the demand, or do we wait until the demand is there and then we put the chargers in? Now, you've just talked about sites that you've got in the UK and the potential sites worldwide that you can put in. And which of those two sides of that sword have you actually fallen down on? Are you putting them in where people are buying pipistrelles, or are you finding the sites and putting them in the hope that the flying schools that are on those sites will then go and get a pipistrelle to be able to use your network?
Well, it's both, really. So you're right, and it needs to be a measured approach. You can't pepper chargers everywhere and in the hope, but we do have very close relationship with the OEMs because we're kind of the only people doing this proactively at the moment. And because we work closely with them, we know how many and where they have orders for aircraft. So certainly part of our build out that's come in will be working with the OEMs for where they're flight testing, because there'll be lots and lots of flights going on there, as you can imagine. It will also be working with the OEMs for where they already have orders. And I mean, there's sites in the US, for example, that have ordered 10, 15 electric aircraft already for particular flight schools. So people are ordering, absolutely. And once these aircraft are built, they're going to need charging facilities. So part of it will be done in partnership with the OEMs. We know whose orders, we know where chargers go, right? Equally, when it comes to, let's say, the build it and they will come approach, if you look at flying schools in the UK, in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and everywhere else that are forward thinking, that want to move to electrification, absolutely we want to work with them. We want to be talking to them about getting charging in ahead of time. Or equally, if you look at airports that have a very forward thinking view, airports that are investing, airports that accept this is part of what they want to be doing in the future, those are the airports that, again, will take the view that it's worth putting in those chargers, because it is those airports and those flight schools that will attract electric aircraft to come. It will attract pilots who want to learn on electric, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of finding those, I suppose, those elements of the industry that are inspired enough to see it and working with them.
And what is your actual offering? Do you go up and say, right, you're going to bring electric planes in, we'll provide the charger and some software to do it? Or is it a little bit more complex than that? Do you have relationships with flight schools, with the airports, in terms of them providing the land, them providing the power to go in there? What's the actual offering that you've got? Are you able to tell us a little bit of detail about that?
Yeah, I can tell you some things, of course. So we don't sell anything. So if you own an airport, I come to you and I want to lease a bit of your land and I want to be there for a long time providing charging services. It costs you nothing. Some of our business is direct with flight schools. We will operate on a flight school owned bit of land, for example, and sublease off them. It may be direct with the airport. That's kind of the lion's share of it. Equally, there's a number of what called FBOs, fixed base operators, who do things like ground handling and looking after aircraft when they're on the ground. Those are equally partners for us, and we're talking to a number of them. So there's no kind of one hard and fast rule for who we go and talk to. Equally, when it comes to power, it's a case of the gold standard. What we'd really like is our own separately metered grid supply. But if we have to work with the airport to come off their supply, then we can do that too. Airports are very different in how they're set up and how they do things and in what's possible. So, yeah, there's no one answer.
And are you having power issues at some of the places that you're putting in? Are you having to have, are there constraints on what you can do because of the power that's there? Are you able to get the power in that you need?
Yes and no. Again, much like car charging, it's a case of some sites, really easy, loads of power. How much do you need? There you go, right? Other sites, there's absolutely nothing because they were built during World War II and have enough power to power a kettle and a few lights, and that's it, right? So it really, there's no one answer. And equally, if I'm putting in car chargers, the power might have to come 10, 20, 30 meters from a road, perhaps. If you're putting in charging on an airfield, it could be 500 or 1,000 meters in that direction, and you're going to have to wait a number of years for it. So it's almost like the problems are a bit magnified in our world because of the distances. And equally, there's a point around there's not much optionality. If I can't put a charger in X fast food retailer there, I can go to Y coffee shop 100 meters down the road and put one in there instead. In airports, there's not another one next door generally. You have to go quite a way. So there's very little optionality. So there's a lot more we have to do to try and realize a site. And actually, we tested that and proved that when we installed at Dunk as well, which is near Exeter. That was one of our early installs. The flight school was taking electric aircraft. We wanted to work with them, prove the concept. And we couldn't get the power we needed. So there we installed a 300 kilowatt hour battery system, which trickle charges off a small single phase supply and then dumps the power out into the chargers as needed. That now, in fact, they've upgraded the site supply and we have another answer now. But that to say essentially that, sometimes you have to do clever things.
As with all sorts of charging, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we made reference earlier on to the fact that, one of the reasons that I don't fly anymore is because when I've got the time, I don't have the money. When I've got the money, I don't have the time, because it is an expensive pastime. So talk to me about how electric aviation is going to potentially reduce the costs.
Well, if you look at flight training, the art of the possible is what this is about. So if you look at the aircraft you can go and buy right now that you can use, or in the coming, let's say 6 to 12 months, you can get delivered and be using in a real setting. Those are 2-seat trainers, right? And the cost of running those is maybe a third of the cost of running a traditional piston engine, and they are a lot simpler to maintain. That's the biggest difference. So the cost of running it, yes, of course, it's cheaper, but the maintenance costs and the fact that there's so little to maintain around an electric aircraft versus a piston, that's where the flight schools are going to see the biggest difference.
And I know when you've got a piston engine plane, you have to monitor the number of hours, and when the engine gets to a certain number of hours, it's got to have a complete overhaul or even a replacement. Is that similar to the electric motors that you put into an electric plane?
Yeah, that's right. There are limited in terms of a number of hours, and piston are a lot more limited. To give you an idea, if you take the Pipistrel versus a current flying piston aircraft, it's about 10 times the range you're allowed to fly before you then have to do any kind of legislated overhaul maintenance type stuff. Because again, there's a lot less that can go wrong. There's a lot less to it, essentially.
Now, you mentioned that you've got charges in it. I think you said 9 sites in the...
7 at the minute.
7 at the minute.
Yep.
Just so that the listeners, or indeed the viewers, if they're watching on YouTube, can sort of understand this. Under ideal circumstances, what's the longest journey I could do purely on electric power between the sites that you've got?
Yeah. So do you mean you're happy to stop, right, Gary? Is that what we're saying? We're happy to take charging stops.
Yes.
So the furthest 2 points on our network currently would be Lydd Airport, which is Dungeness, that area.
The coast in Kent, yeah.
Down there, coast of Kent. And then the furthest away from that's, let's say, flyable in various hops would be Dunk as well in Exeter.
Okay.
So
200
you fly
miles?
across the south coast. I don't know how many miles it is. think it'll be about 4.5 hours driving, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, you can save yourself some time.
Absolutely.
We do have one in Snowdonia as well because of the testing. They test some electric aircraft there, but that currently we need to link up to the rest of the network.
No, that makes sense. That's not bad, actually. One of the big issues that people have with public electric vehicle charging is obviously the price, because a lot of people do that thing which they shouldn't really do, but they do, which is say, well, I can charge at 7 pence a kilowatt hour overnight, and it's, pick your figure, 75, 85, 95 pence a kilowatt hour on public charging. Now, there isn't that kind of comparison to be made when you're looking at charging an electric aircraft.
That's
but
right.
There is obviously going to be a price aspect to this. So how do you actually price the charging within the Aerovolt systems?
So at the moment, it's roughly comparative to car charging.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some sites currently are about 59 pence a kilowatt. The highest we've currently priced anything at is £1 a kilowatt. But if you compare that to public charging now at 80 odd pence, I think most places generally for a rapid, I think it's roughly comparable. As I say, versus avgas and aviation fuel, that's a lot cheaper. So it's not the same level of price sensitivity in this market. The price of our network will change, definitely. But I also think it's a case of we know that for the foreseeable future, the price of charging needs to be kept as competitive, as low as possible, because we want people to be flying electric. We want flight schools to see this as a really good alternative. So, yeah, it's roughly comparative to car charging at the moment.
Now, we're coming to the end of the discussion, but there's two things one thing in particular I want to talk about, which is that I believe you were involved with Porsche and a couple of the ex-Top Gear guys in a little stunt this year. Do you want to, or actually with the back end of last year, beginning this year, do you want to tell us a little bit about that, please?
Yeah. Was it that long ago?
Did you?
Time really flies, doesn't it? It was
last year. It was actually filmed and released in.
It was meant to be back end of last year. We ended up doing it. I think it was April, May. I'd have to check my dates. Anyway, it's on YouTube. Yes, do go watch it. I think we're up to about 3 million views now, probably due to the fact it was with James May and Richard Hammond. It is on the Drive Tribe YouTube channel. Yeah, and that came about because again, we're the first of something. And if you put in aircraft charging to Google, all the first page is Aerovolt. I don't know what's on page 2 because nobody looks at page 2 of Google, obviously. That's the graveyard, right? But all of that is us. Anyway, so that means we get weird phone calls and unexpected phone calls, like one we received sort of back end of last year from Porsche. And they called us up and said, we have a new Taycan coming out. We've seen your network and your plane. Would you like a race? And we said, yeah. So fast forward to a meeting with the Porsche marketing team, and we cooked up this idea. I mentioned that I remember James had a pilot's license because he flew in a couple of Top Gear episodes, if you remember. And fast forward to, yes, we ended up doing a race with James and Richard, which was the world's first electric car versus electric plane race.
Oh, where did it go between? What were the start and end point?
We started at Henstridge Aerodrome, which is kind of a bit north of Devon, not quite Devon, but north of Devon, that area. I'm terrible at geography. Certainly know where UK counties are. Anyway, so we started at Henstridge and we finished at Dunsfold, and we went via Thruxton. So it was Henstridge, Thruxton, Dunsfold. Thruxton, great airport, great racetrack, long history in motorsport, a lot of money being put into Thruxton, actually really exciting time. So it was worth visiting them. And then we went on to Dunsfold, which most of you will better know as the old Top Gear test track. So that was obviously why we finished there. And it was a very good race. The weather did impact the race somewhat, and I will leave it at that, and you'll have to have a look at the results yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to spoil it, but you obviously would have sat and done the maths and said, well, this is not going to be plain sailing for one or the other. It's obviously going to be very, very...
We knew it would be close. It's just, if we'd have done it in Florida, it would have been a different outcome, I think. But, British weather being what it is.
Oh, well. But yeah, excellent video. I will link that in the show notes and recommend people to go out and have a look at it.
Appreciate it.
Guys, is there anything else you'd like to say about electric aviation before we wrap up?
Yeah, I suppose my message on electric aviation is most people are surprised when I tell them, people, let's say, that don't know me, people from outside the industry, people ask you what you do. And when they end up talking about building a charging network for electric aircraft, most people are astounded that A, that's a thing, and that B, we have electric planes. And I suppose the message would be, yes, we do have electric aircraft currently flying. And B, it's a lot closer than you think. I think people, the wider industry, of aviation. Going back to really the start of our conversation, I think people have a view that it's going to be really, really hard to decarbonize it, almost impossible, and we need to kind of stop flying, and the aviation industry gets a bit of a flogging. I would respond to that by saying, if you look at the art of the possible with current tech, and yes, it's smaller aircraft, and yes, it's flight training, but that accounts for a lot of hours. 80% of aviation is general aviation, which doesn't mean the commercial stuff. That's people flying around in small aircraft. And there's already decarbonisation strategies and options in place to do that. So there's a lot of possibility and hope in the world of aviation. Yes, the bigger stuff remains tough to decarbonise, but there's a lot of people with much bigger brains than me building realistic solutions for that. It will take time, but I suppose the message is there's a lot of hope if, going back to the conference that you and I attended, if there's action. And I think it comes down to people and businesses taking action. But yeah, we can get there.
Absolutely, 100%. Guy Haydon, thanks a lot for your time. Very much appreciated.
Cheers, Gary. Thank you.
So a few quick takeaways from this discussion with Guy. Now, Guy is obviously passionate about aviation, and his approach is slightly less radical than mine, and I appreciate that. But he is working in a sector that understands and appreciates that electric aviation, even with the limitations that exist at the moment, is something that will develop as we move forward. More powerful batteries, larger planes, better charging infrastructure, especially in the general aviation world, will ensure that you can do the same sort of flights you do at the moment in a Cessna, but for far less cost and a much lower carbon footprint. Guy mentioned that the longest electric flight he could do at the moment in the UK is from Lydd in Kent to Dunkers in Devon, which is a distance of 181 miles. It's approximately 300 kilometres in a straight line. And just for reference, that's the same distance as Lydd in Kent to Amsterdam. So whilst electric aviation has a way to go, there's definitely signs that it's starting to experience the sort of uptake that EVs did back in the day. Guy's reference to the Pipistrel aircraft that his company owns as being like the Nissan Leaf of the day, it actually bodes really well, and I quite like that comparison. So what are your thoughts on electric aviation? Let me know, info@evmusings.com. Now it's time for a cool EV or renewable thing to share with your listeners. And in keeping with the electric aviation aspect of this episode, the cool thing relates to something that we did actually mention in the discussion with Guy, which is the Beta Technologies, who have successfully completed their first passenger flight of its electric CTOL, conventional takeoff and landing aircraft, the Alia, from Long Island to JFK Airport. This 45-minute flight had 4 passengers on board, showcasing the potential for quiet and emission-free air travel. The flight marks a significant step towards commercial operations, and it supports efforts to reduce carbon emissions in urban areas. Now, obviously, this is just the first of many steps towards full passenger certification, but with a range of around 300 nautical miles on a 1-hour charge, this aircraft certainly has a lot of potential. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's show. It was put together this week with the help of Guy Haydon. Thank you very much to Guy for his time. If you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, or other general messages to pass on to me, I can be reached at info@evmusings.com. On the socials, I'm on Blue Sky at evmusings.bsky.social. I'm also on Instagram at evmusings, where I post those little short videos and the odd podcast extract regularly. Why not follow me there? Many thanks to everyone who supports me through Patreon on a monthly basis and through coffee.com on an ad hoc basis. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. Regular listeners will know about my 2 ebooks. So you've gone electric and so you've gone renewable. Now they're 99p each or equivalent, and you can get them on the Kindle store on Amazon. Now check out the links in the show notes for more information, as well as a link to my regular EV Musings newsletter and associated articles. Now, I've spoke to a few of you, and I know that you're probably driving, walking, jogging, ironing, or sat on the sofa watching this on your phone. But if you can remember and you enjoyed the episode, drop a review in iTunes, please. Like, subscribe, leave a comment on YouTube, because it really helps. Thank you very much. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by messaging me at musingsev.bsky.social with the words, "The sky's the limit," hashtag if you know you know, nothing else. And thanks, as always, to my co-founder, Simon. I always thought his electric unicycle thing was just a pastime. something he did to get out of the house and out into the fresh air. But it seems I was wrong. He sees it as something bigger, especially if it becomes a little more widespread and accepted. Not here in the UK, obviously.
But if you look at mainland Europe, there's a lot to be said for very good public transport systems.
Thanks for listening. Bye.